Imagine a world lit only by the sun, the moon, and the flickering flames of a hearth fire. A world where the year wasn't marked by a calendar on a wall, but by the turning of the seasons. This was early medieval Europe, a place where life moved at the pace of an ox-drawn plow. For the vast majority of people, their entire existence unfolded within a few miles of their birthplace. They lived and died by the cycles of planting and harvesting, their days dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. Their minds were guided by three powerful forces: faith, tradition, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. The world beyond their village was a tapestry of myth and monsters, a dark forest where anything could lurk. In this uncertain existence, there was one constant, one towering beacon of stability and hope: the church. Cathedrals and humble parish churches alike were more than just buildings. They were the very heart of the community. They were the centers of social life, the keepers of time, the providers of what little education existed. In a world fraught with hardship, disease, and the constant threat of famine or war, the church offered a narrative that gave life meaning. It promised salvation, a divine order to the chaos, and a place of eternal peace after a life of toil. The tolling of a church bell was the rhythm of daily life, calling people to prayer, marking the hours, and announcing every major life event from birth to death. And within this world of faith, there were special sanctuaries, places of profound peace and learning. The monasteries, dotted across the landscape of Europe, from the windswept coasts of Ireland to the rolling hills of Francia. These were communities set apart from the world. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, work, and study. Following the strict rule of St. Benedict, ora et labora, pray and work. These monasteries were islands of tranquility and knowledge in a sea of illiteracy and violence. Within their stone walls, precious manuscripts were painstakingly copied by hand, preserving the wisdom of the ancient world. Herbal gardens were cultivated, providing remedies and medical care for the surrounding communities. They were economic powerhouses, centers of agriculture, brewing, and craftsmanship. More than anything, monasteries were considered inviolable. They were holy ground, God's own property on earth. There was a deeply held belief, a sacred understanding, that even the most brutal and lawless warlord would not dare to defile such a place. To attack a monastery was not just a crime against people, it was a sin against God himself. They were seen as untouchable havens, their treasures of gold chalices, jeweled crosses, and illuminated gospels protected not by high walls or armed guards, but by the sheer power of faith and the fear of divine retribution. This belief, this fundamental pillar of their world, was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable, and it would shatter completely. Because far to the north, across the cold, gray expanse of the North Sea, another world existed. A world forged not by prayer and parchment, but by iron, ice, and an unyielding will to survive. This was the land of the Norsemen. In Scandinavia, the rugged fjord-scarred lands of modern-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, life was harsh and resources were scarce. The growing season was short, the winters long and unforgiving. Here, strength was not just a virtue, it was a necessity. A man was measured by his courage, his loyalty to his chieftain, and the sharpness of his axe. Their society was built around honor, reputation, and the pursuit of wealth, which brought influence and power. Their faith was a pantheon of powerful, often capricious gods: Odin, the All-Father, who traded a knife for wisdom; Thor, the mighty thunder god with his powerful hammer; Mjolnir, protector of mankind; Freya, the goddess of love and war. Their afterlife wasn't a peaceful paradise, but Valhalla, a great hall where warriors chosen by Odin would feast and fight until the final battle of Ragnar. It was a religion that celebrated bravery in battle and promised glory to those who died with a weapon in their hand. For centuries, these Norse people had been traders, explorers, and, yes, raiders, but mostly among their own coastlines. They were master shipbuilders. Their creation, the longship, was a technological marvel, clinker-built for flexibility and strength, with a shallow draft and a symmetrical design. It was a vessel of incredible versatility. It could navigate the treacherous open ocean, riding the Atlantic swells, and then, with equal ease, glide up shallow rivers, bringing its crew deep into the heart of an unsuspecting land. The iconic dragon's head carved on the prow was not just decoration. It was designed to strike terror into the hearts of all who saw it. In the late 8th century, something changed. A combination of factors, perhaps overpopulation in their homelands, internal political strife, or simply the lure of the well-documented but poorly defended riches. To the South ignited a new ambition. Their gaze turned outward, across the sea. They had heard tales of the wealthy kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, and the Irish. They had heard of monasteries, filled with gold and silver, protected by nothing but prayers. To the Norsemen, these places were not sanctuaries. They were simply treasure chests, waiting to be opened. The year is 793. The place is the holy island of Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the northeast coast of England. Lindisfarne was one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England. It was a center of Celtic Christianity, a place of immense learning and spiritual significance, home to the relics of St. Cuthbert. The monks of Lindisfarne lived a quiet, contemplative life, praying, fishing, and creating masterpieces like the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts ever made. On a calm June day, the monks saw them, strange ships with terrifying dragon heads and single, square sails. They moved with a speed and silence that was alien. The alarm was raised, but what could they do? They were men of God, not men of war. They had no weapons, no training. They had only their faith. The Norsemen, whom we would come to call Vikings, stormed ashore. They were not an army. They were a raiding party, a whirlwind of terrifying violence. They moved with a brutal efficiency that stunned the peaceful monks. They were armed with swords, spears, and their fearsome axes, which could cleave through a shield or a skull with a single blow. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, describes the horror. Here terrible portents came about over the land of Northumbria and miserably frightened the people. These were immense flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine immediately followed these signs, and a little after that, in the same year, the ravaging of wretched heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. The Vikings showed no reverence for the holy place. They slaughtered the monks where they stood, hunted down those who fled, and drowned others in the sea. They smashed holy relics, tore the jewel-encrusted covers from sacred books, and piled the church's treasures, gold crosses, silver chalices, anything of value into their lawn. They took some of the younger monks as slaves. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they were gone, disappearing back over the horizon, leaving behind a scene of carnage, smoke, and disbelief. The news of the raid on Lindisfarne sent a shockwave of terror across Christian Europe. The scholar Alcuin of York, who was serving at the court of Charlemagne, wrote a letter to the king of Northumbria, his voice trembling with horror and confusion. Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. The unthinkable had happened. Holy ground had been violated. God, it seemed, had not protected his own. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. If a place as sacred as Lindisfarne was not safe, then where was? Nowhere. The invisible shield of faith had been shattered, and a new and terrifying age had dawned. Lindisfarne was not a one-off event. It was the beginning. The floodgates had opened. In the years and decades that followed, the Viking longships became a terrifyingly familiar sight along every coast and every navigable river in Europe. They sacked the monastery at Iona in Scotland, the wealthy trading towns of Dorestad in the Netherlands, and Quentivik in Francia. They sailed up the Seine to besiege Paris, up the Shannon to raid the monasteries of Ireland, and even ventured into the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Spain and Italy. This was the start of the Viking Age, a period of roughly 300 years where Norse raiders, traders, and settlers would profoundly reshape the political, economic, and cultural map of Europe. They were not just mindless barbarians. They were savvy opportunists. They established vast trade networks, founded cities like Dublin in Ireland and Kiev in modern-day Ukraine. They settled and gave their name to Normandy in France, and their conquests led to the creation of the Kingdom of England. But it all began on that summer day at Lindisfarne. It began when two worlds collided. One, a world of quiet faith, slow seasons, and the belief in sacred, untouchable spaces. The other, a world of cold iron, daring seamanship, and a hunger for wealth and glory. The meeting of these two worlds was violent, brutal, and transformative. It burned churches, toppled kingdoms, and forged new nations from the fire and blood. The Vikings had arrived, and Europe would never, ever be the same. Thanks for watching. If you're fascinated by this pivotal moment in history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments what other historical clashes you'd like to see covered. See you next time. Imagine an island so holy that it's whispered about across all of Christian Europe. An island shrouded in mist and sea spray, accessible only when the tide allows. This wasn't just any piece of land. This was Lindisfarne, the Holy Island. Perched on the windswept coast of Northumbria, it was more than a monastery. It was a beacon of faith, a powerhouse of culture, and a sanctuary in a violent world. The story of Lindisfarne begins in the 7th century, a time when Anglo-Saxon England was a patchwork of warring kingdoms. In this era of chaos, a king named Oswald sought to bring Christianity to his people in Northumbria. He didn't turn to Rome. Instead, he looked to the Irish monks of Iona, a community known for its deep spirituality and missionary zeal. In 635 AD, a gentle monk named Aidan answered the call. King Oswald gave him Lindisfarne, and from this small tidal island, the light of Christianity would spread across the north of England. Why this island? Its isolation was key. Twice a day, the North Sea would surge, cutting Lindisfarne off from the mainland. This created a perfect, natural cloister, a place where monks could dedicate themselves to God without the distractions of the secular world. It was a place for contemplation, for prayer, and for a deep connection with the divine, surrounded by the raw, untamed beauty of nature. The cry of gulls and the roar of the waves became the soundtrack to their devotion. Under Aidan and his successors, Lindisfarne flourished. It became a major center of learning and art. The monks weren't just praying. They were scholars, scribes, and artists of incredible skill. They established a scriptorium, a library and workshop where manuscripts were painstakingly copied and illuminated. The most famous creation to emerge from this holy place is a masterpiece that still mesmerizes us today: the Lindisfarne Gospels. This isn't just a book. It's a work of art, a testament to faith, and a pinnacle of human creativity. Created around the year 700 in honor of St. Cuthbert, a later bishop of Lindisfarne, the Gospels are a breathtaking fusion of Celtic, Germanic, and Roman artistic styles. Each page is a riot of color and intricate design. We see mesmerizing Celtic knots, swirling spirals, and stylized animals woven into the sacred text. The level of detail is almost microscopic. The artist, believed to be a single monk named Edfrith, used a limited palette of locally sourced pigments to create something of universal and everlasting beauty. The Lindisfarne Gospels were a symbol of the monastery's wealth, not just in gold, but in talent and devotion. It was a treasure beyond price. And speaking of St. Cuthbert, he is perhaps the most beloved figure associated with Lindisfarne. He started as a simple monk, but his piety and wisdom were so great that he became the bishop. Yet, Cuthbert longed for a life of solitude. He eventually retired to a tiny, even more remote island nearby, living as a hermit in constant prayer. When Ediad, his body was brought back to Lindisfarne, and tales of miracles at his tomb began to spread. Pilgrims from all over Britain and Europe flocked to the Holy Island, seeking healing, forgiveness, and a connection to the saint. Cuthbert's presence turned Lindisfarne into a major pilgrimage site, a place where heaven and earth felt truly close. But it wasn't just men who found a spiritual home here. Lindisfarne was also a place for women of faith. While we hear much about the monks, it's crucial to remember the nuns who also lived lives of devotion on or near the island. In an age where women's choices were severely limited, the convent offered an alternative path. It was a refuge from arranged marriages, the dangers of childbirth, and the constant threat of violence that defined the era. Here, women could pursue a life of the mind and spirit. They prayed, they studied, they cared for the sick, and they contributed to the spiritual life of the community. They were an essential, though often overlooked, part of the Lindisfarne story. So, let's paint a picture of daily life. Imagine waking before dawn to the sound of a bell. The monks and nuns would gather in the cold stone church for the first of many daily prayers. Their days were structured by a rhythm of worship, work, and study. The work part was vital. They farmed the island's land, fished in the surrounding sea, and practiced crafts to support their community. They weren't idle dreamers. They were a self-sufficient, highly organized society. They brewed their own ale, baked their own bread, and managed the vast estates that had been gifted to the monastery. This wealth, both spiritual and material, made Lindisfarne famous. The island held not just the Gospels, but also finely crafted silver chalices, jeweled crosses, and precious relics of the saints. It was a symbol of Christian power and Northumbrian pride. But this fame, this concentration of treasure and piety, would ultimately attract a new, terrifying kind of visitor. The year is 793, Juni Ocho. The monks are going about their daily routines. The tides are turning, and the island is at peace. Then, on the horizon, they appear. Long ships, sleek, fast, and menacing. This was the first time the Vikings had raided England, and they chose Lindisfarne as their target. It was a calculated and devastating blow. The Vikings knew the monastery was wealthy and poorly defended. The monks were men of peace, not warriors. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, describes the horror. Fiery dragons were seen flying in the air, and soon followed a great famine. And after that, in the same year, the harrowing of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne, with rapine and slaughter. The raiders plundered the treasures, burned the buildings, and killed the monks. They desecrated the altar, and desecrated this most holy of places. The attack on Lindisfarne sent shockwaves across Europe. It was unthinkable. How could God allow his sacred island to be violated? For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a profound crisis of faith. Was this a punishment for their sins? Was it the beginning of the end of days? The scholar Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne in France, lamented, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." The Viking raid of 793 marked the beginning of a new age of terror and uncertainty. But it was not the end of Lindisfarne. The surviving monks eventually fled, taking their greatest treasure with them, the body of St. Cuthbert and the Lindisfarne Gospels. For over a century, they wandered northern England, carrying their sacred heritage, before finally settling in Durham. It is there that St. Cuthbert is buried today, in the magnificent Durham Cathedral. Lindisfarne itself was eventually re-established, but its golden age was over. The memory of the raid, however, never faded. It became a powerful symbol, a symbol of the clash between Christianity and paganism, of the fragility of peace, and of the resilience of faith. Today, when you walk the Pilgrim's Way across the sands to Holy Island at low tide, you're treading in the footsteps of saints, scholars, pilgrims, and kings. You can explore the ruins of the later priory, feel the weight of history in the air, and gaze out at the same wild sea that brought both St. Aidan and the Viking raiders. Lindisfarne was never just a monastery. It was the cradle of Christianity in the north, a beacon of learning in the Dark Ages, a world-renowned center for art, and a sanctuary of peace. Its story, from its glorious founding to its violent sacking, is a powerful reminder of the light that can shine in the darkest of times, and how even in ruins, a legacy can endure. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, please give this video a like and subscribe for more stories from the crossroads of history. Let me know in the comments what other historical sites you'd love to explore. See you next time. The real story, as always, is far more complex and way more interesting. For starters, let's get that horned helmet out of the way. So, if we got something that basics so wrong, what else have we misunderstood about them? They were people tied to the land, working hard to coax crops from the rocky, often unforgiving soil of Scandinavia. They were also skilled craftsmen, creating beautiful jewelry, intricate wood carvings, and some of the most advanced ships of their time. They were traders, establishing vast networks that stretched from North America to the Middle East. They were explorers, daring to sail into the unknown, discovering and settling places like Iceland and Greenland long before the rest of Europe even knew they existed. So, where did the barbarian reputation come from? Well, it's not like it came from nowhere. When Vikings went raiding, they were brutally effective. The Viking Age, which we usually date from the late 8th to the mid-11th century, began with a bang. A very terrifying, very real bang for the people on the receiving end. But to understand why they did it, we need to look at the world from their perspective. Imagine living in what is now Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. 1,000 years ago, your world is one of long, dark, bitterly cold winters. The land you can farm is limited, and the growing season is short. A bad harvest could mean starvation for your entire family. Society was highly competitive. Status, honor, and wealth weren't just nice things to have. They were essential for survival, for attracting a partner, and for securing your family's future. In this context, raiding wasn't just mindless violence. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy for getting ahead. It was a way for a young man with few prospects at home to gain wealth, fame, and respect. A successful raid could set you up for life. You could return with silver, gold, and other valuables, allowing you to buy land, build a better farm, and increase your influence in the community. It was a path to social mobility in a world with very few options. Think of it like a dangerous, seasonal enterprise. During the harsh winter, you'd stay home, mend your tools, and tell stories around the fire. But when the weather turned fair and the seas became navigable, the raiding season began. Groups of men would band together, hop in their incredible longships, and set off to find their fortune. Their ships were the key to their success. The Viking longship was a technological marvel. It was long, narrow, and light. In the year 793, a group of Norse raiders descended upon the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of northern England. The monastery at Lindisfarne was one of the most revered centers of Christianity in Britain. It was a place of learning, prayer, and peace. And then the Vikings came. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the time, describes the event with pure horror. Fierce, foreboding omens came over the land, and, a little after that, the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne Island, with plunder and slaughter. To the Christian monks who wrote these accounts, the Vikings were agents of the devil, heathens who had no respect for God or his holy places. But again, let's see it from the Viking point of view. They weren't heathens in their own minds. They had their own complex and powerful belief system, with gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya. Their gods were gods of war, strength, and cunning. When they saw a Christian monastery filled with treasure, they didn't see a holy sanctuary. They saw a hoard of wealth protected by followers of a foreign god, a god who clearly wasn't powerful enough to protect his own people. Their religious beliefs didn't prevent them from raiding. In fact, they might have encouraged it. If you could defeat your enemies and take their stuff, it was a sign that your gods were stronger. This is a crucial point. The people who wrote the history books, the monks and clerics of Europe, were the very people being targeted by the Vikings. So, of course, their accounts are going to be a little biased. They weren't interested in the socioeconomic reasons for the raids. They saw terrifying, godless savagers who came to burn and kill. And that image, written down in ink and copied for centuries, is the one that has largely survived. But the Viking Age wasn't just about raiding England. They went everywhere. They sailed south and raided the coasts of France, Spain, and even Italy. They sailed east, down the great rivers of Russia, reaching all the way to Constantinople, the capital of the mighty Byzantine Empire. There, they were so respected for their fighting ability that the emperor hired them as his personal bodyguards, the elite Varangian Guard. In these eastern lands, they were known less as raiders and more as traders. They were called the Rus, which is where the name Russia comes from. They traded furs, amber, and slaves for silver and silk from the Arab world and Byzantium. This side of the Vikings, the merchant and the explorer, is just as important as the warrior. Over time, the nature of Viking activity changed. The early hit-and-run raids evolved into larger-scale invasions. Huge Viking armies, like the great heathen army that landed in England in the 860s, came not just to plunder, but to conquer and settle. They established their own kingdoms and territories, like the Danelaw in England and Normandy in France. The Normans, literally Northmen, were descended from Vikings who settled there, and it was their leader, William the Conqueror, a direct descendant of a Viking chieftain, who would go on to conquer England in 1066. So, were the Vikings violent? Absolutely. Were their raids terrifying for their victims? Without a doubt. But were they just mindless barbarians? Not at all. They were a complex and dynamic people, driven by a mixture of ambition, desperation, and opportunity. They were farmers, traders, poets, explorers, and, yes, warriors. Their story is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and a relentless pursuit of a better life in a harsh and unforgiving world. The next time you see that image of a Viking with a horned helmet, remember the real people behind the myth? The farmers scanning the sky for signs of spring, the shipbuilder shaping a plank with an axe, the merchant haggling in a bustling foreign market, and the explorer staring out at an endless, unknown sea. Their legacy is so much more than just the raid. It's about the courage to venture into the unknown, a quality that reshaped the world. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical myths you'd like to see us tackle next. See you in the next one. Ever wonder why Vikings, the legendary raiders of the North, seemed to have a particular obsession with monasteries? It wasn't just random. It was a calculated, devastatingly effective strategy. To understand why, you need to see the world through a Viking's eyes. In their world, strength was survival, and weakness was an invitation to be conquered. So, let's look at a typical early medieval monastery. What did the Vikings see? They saw treasure chests, practically overflowing. These weren't just places of prayer. They were the banks of their time. Kings and nobles donated vast amounts of wealth, gold, silver, precious jewels, to secure their place in the afterlife. The monasteries housed stunningly crafted religious artifacts, golden chalices, silver crucifixes, and gospel books adorned with gems. To a Viking, this wasn't sacred. It was loot. It was the jackpot. But it wasn't just about the bling. Monasteries were also storehouses. They had vast reserves of food, grain, wine, and livestock. For a raiding party far from home, this was as valuable as gold. A successful raid on a monastery meant you could resupply your ships, feed your crew, and continue your campaign for weeks or even months longer. It was a one-stop shop for wealth and logistics. Now, consider the location of these monasteries. Many were deliberately built in isolated, remote places. Think of islands like Lindisfarne, or Iona, or locations deep in the countryside. The idea was to create a sanctuary, a place far from the worldly distractions and temptations of cities and towns. The monks sought peace and solitude to be closer to God. But this isolation, which was meant to be a spiritual strength, became a fatal military weakness. For a Viking longship, these remote locations were perfect. They could sail up rivers or along coastlines, appearing suddenly without any warning. There were no scouts, no city walls, no local militia to raise the alarm. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the Vikings were already ashore, axes in hand. The very seclusion that the monks cherished made them sitting ducks. And here's the most crucial part: the defense, or rather, the complete lack of it. Monasteries were communities of peace. The men inside were scholars, scribes, and farmers, not warriors. They had no walls, no towers, no soldiers. Their entire worldview was built on faith and nonviolence. They believed they were protected by God, that these holy sites were inviolable sanctuaries that no Christian would dare to attack. This is where the massive culture clash happens. The Vikings were not Christian. They worshipped Odin, Thor, and the Norse pantheon. They had absolutely no respect for the Christian God or his holy places. To them, a building full of unarmed men, who believed prayer was their only shield, was the easiest target imaginable. The monks' faith, in a brutal, tactical sense, was their greatest vulnerability. So when the Vikings landed, they weren't just met with a lack of physical resistance. They were met with a psychological one that they could shatter. The monks would pray. They would hold up their crosses, believing that a divine power would intervene. For a Viking warrior, seeing this was not a sign of spiritual strength. It was a sign of utter weakness. It was an opponent who refused to fight back. This leads to the element of terror. Viking raids were not just about grabbing loot and leaving. They were about psychological warfare. Fear was their sharpest weapon. When they attacked a monastery, the violence was extreme and theatrical. They wanted to send a message that would echo across the entire kingdom. They weren't just breaking down doors. They were breaking down the very foundation of their enemy's society. Think about it from the perspective of a local Anglo-Saxon or Frankish villager. You're told the god is all-powerful and that his houses on earth are sacred and protected. Then, one day, you hear that the monastery at Lindisfarne has been ransacked. Monks have been killed, treasures stolen, and the holy place The raiders came, took what they wanted, and sailed away completely unharmed by divine wrath. What does that do to your morale? It plants a seed of doubt. It makes you question everything you believe in. If God can't even protect his own monks in his own house, how can he possibly protect you in your small village? The fear becomes paralyzing. It shatters the confidence of rulers and the faith of the common people. This terror made future raids easier, as resistance crumbled not just from the force of arms, but from the force of fear. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Mercy was not a virtue in their warrior culture. It was a flaw. Showing leniency to a weak enemy was foolish. By attacking the softest, most revered targets, they maximized their profit, minimized their risk, and created a legend of terror that preceded them wherever they went. It was a brutal, cold, and calculated strategy. They weren't just pirates. They were masters of psychological warfare. So, when you picture a Viking raid on a monastery, don't just see a simple robbery. See a clash of civilizations, a collision of two completely different belief systems. On one side, a world of faith, peace, and symbolic wealth. On the other, a world of iron, pragmatism, and raw power. The Vikings saw a target that was rich, undefended, isolated, and psychologically fragile. For them, it was the perfect storm, the ultimate opportunity. The story of these raids is not just a story of violence. It is the story of how a small group of raiders figured out how to break the spirit of an entire continent, not just by breaking bodies, but by breaking belief itself. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the Viking mindset interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more history breakdowns. See you in the next one.